The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
We are back. In case you're wondering, with George Case. I'm Ralph Tycho with the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and George is here, I'm here, and David Hubler is here. Hello, David.
And Ron Rabinovitz is here.
And Ron, I just asked about you. I'm glad you're here.
How are you, Ralph?
How are you guys?
Yeah, hi, Ronnie. Welcome.
Hello.
Hi, George. How are you?
All right. George, take it away. You have a great one, the three of you.
Okay, well, what I'd like to do, we're having this podcast a few days before Memorial Day, and I thought it would be very appropriate if we talk about Washington baseball and the World War II era. And I just felt that it would be a good idea for David, with his wonderful book on the Nats and the Grays, to talk about, Washington baseball during that era, and then we'll go on from there. But David, if you would take it over and talk a little bit about, your book and what is the content, and it's really a very, very well researched and well documented effort that on your part. And this is a topic that's very near and dear to me because of my dad playing during that era. But David, I'd like to have you start this with, your comments about World War II baseball in Washington in your book.
Okay. Well, the Nats and the Grays covers 1941 through 1945, with a little what I call extra innings in there, which covers the advent of Jackie Robinson coming into the Brooklyn Dodgers. So I thought what we'd start off with, I have a couple of introductory paragraphs here that I thought would really set the tone for this Memorial Day, and especially here in Washington. So let me read that, and then we can get going, and we'll take it from there. Okay, 1941. War came to America when Major League Baseball was in its winter hibernation, and diamonds had given way to gridirons. It came at the hands of a nation that loved baseball almost as much as the United States, and whose gift of 3,000 cherry trees in 1912 had become an icon of the nation's capital, also home to Washington's Major League Baseball team. Commonly called the Senators, but officially the Nationals, Washington's baseball fortunes in the 1941 season had concluded in September with another losing season in sixth place, tied with the St. Louis Browns with identical records of 70 wins and 84 losses. It was an improvement over the seventh-place finish in 1940, when the Nationals recorded a 64-90 record. So now we'll skip to let me just continue here. In December of 1941, the 25 players, coaches, and Bucky Harris, in his second season as manager, had dispersed to the far corners of the United States for their winter jobs in farms, factories, and other pursuits that supplemented the few $1,000s they earned on the playing field. Clark Griffith, the team owner, had retired to his home in suburban Maryland to prepare for the annual owners' meeting in Chicago. Now we skip to that fateful day, September 7th, 1941. On that cold, blustery day, Griffith Stadium, built in 1911 and demolished in 1965, was hosting the final professional football game of the season between the Washington Redskins and the Philadelphia Eagles. Kickoff was set for 2 p.m. Eastern Time, 8:30 in Hawaii. In 1941, unlike today, Hawaii was in a half-hour time zone, so the attack on Pearl Harbor began at 7:55 a.m. in Hawaii, or 1:25 in Washington. Bombs had already fallen on the U.S. fleet. Men had died. War had come. In the stands, no one knew, recalled S.L. Price in the November 1999 Sports Illustrated article. Only the boys in the press box had any idea. Just before kickoff, an Associated Press reporter named Pat O'Brien got a message ordering him to keep his story short. When O'Brien complained, another message flashed, "The Japanese have kicked off. War now." But Redskin owner George Preston Marshall refused to allow the public address announcer to broadcast the news, claiming it would be a distraction to the fans. That made Griffith Stadium one of the last outposts of the era an era that had already slipped away, Price writes. Soon, however, the mood of the 27,000 and even the players on the frozen field began to wonder what was happening as one by one the PA announcer called military officers by name and told them to report to their duty stations immediately. Nearby, in government buildings across D.C., personnel officers burned the telephone wires, calling on the desks their specialized personnel in the services, who were immediately responded to the situation in the Pacific. As radios and newspapers across the country blasted out the news, Americans were dumbfounded, angry, and also fearful. CBS radio reporter Eric Sevareid, who later went on to TV fame, described the reactions on the streets of Washington, said the crowds had the same frightening look he had seen on the faces of Parisians a year earlier when the Nazis marched into the French capital. He reported, too, that his colleague Edward R. Murrow detected a fear he remembered from the worst days of the London Blitz. Recalling that Sunday, years later, Redskin quarterback Sammy Barr told Sports Illustrated's Price, "We didn't know what the hell was going on. I had never heard so many announcements and one right after another. We felt something was up, but we kept on playing." For Eagle halfback Nick Baska, it was the final game of his career. Baska enlisted in the Army 3 days later and was killed in action in France on November 11, 1944, when a mortar shell tore through the tank he was driving. So that sets the scene in D.C., and I find it really quite a moving picture there of all of these people being called out of their seats at Griffith Stadium, and the rest of the people and the players seemingly dumbfounded by what was going on. Now, that's a Sunday. The next day, the baseball owners' meeting was scheduled to begin in Chicago. Most of the owners had already arrived in Chicago, probably by train in those days, and they were prepared at that point to discuss trades, scheduling, all sorts of business matters, and of course, by the time they convened on Monday, the only topic was, will the game continue? And George, if you please, Ronnie, you want to step in, add an anecdote or two. I was going to start talking about the famous green light letter from the Commissioner Landis to Major League Baseball. But
yeah, I'm glad you're going to talk about that, David, because I think that's a significant part of all this, and I appreciated what you did to set the stage because, during the off season, obviously the players, the owners were thinking about the 42 season, and then all of a sudden Pearl Harbor happened, and that changed the dynamic completely. So, if you would, and Ronnie, if you wanted to step in, please feel free to do so. But
yeah, I just think that it's so amazing, George and David, just to set that scene the way you did. I think it was fabulous.
Thank you.
It had to be very harrowing for everybody, and as you say, the players not knowing what's going on, and they're calling all these officers, to report.
Mm-hmm.
It had to be just a very, very difficult period of time. And they knew something was up, but they didn't know what it was.
Well, I think that's right, Ronnie. They didn't know,
yeah.
and there was so much uncertainty in it, and it isn't like today where you have instant news. I mean, this was
right.
all, as Pearl Harbor had happened, and nobody really knew until, these isolated reports came in, and then all of a sudden, the country is
now it's instant.
Turmoil.
In those days, it took a long time.
Right, it sure did, and so David, if you want, you can talk about, because I think that it's very significant, the so-called green light letter, and you and I both had some feelings about it. But why don't you just, to our listeners, talk a little bit about the green light letter, the background to it, and what it really meant for baseball.
Sure. The commissioner at the time was the very first commissioner, Kennesaw Mountain Landis. He had been appointed in 1920 following the Black Sox scandal he'd been a judge for many years, and he was selected to try to clear up the game, give its good name back. But Landis despised Roosevelt. Landis was a very conservative Midwesterner, and of course Truman. FDR was a New York patrician from the Hudson Valley and a Democrat. And frankly, FDR had no use for Landis either. So early on in February, I believe it was, Landis sent a letter to the president asking him what he would like to do in terms of baseball. Landis was speaking for the major league owners. And there was an overwhelming support. Immediately after the war began, and right in early 1942, a poll was taken, and the overwhelming majority of Americans said, keep the game going. Anyway, Landis sent this letter to Roosevelt, and it's called the Green Light Letter these days, and you can find a blow-up copy of it if you go to the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. The letter asked him, what do you want to do? Now, some people have thought that the letter was an earnest attempt to decide what to do with the game. But the fact that he had no use at all for Roosevelt, and he had almost unlimited powers, it's quite possible that he did it as a way to entrap FDR to say, well, we're going to cancel the season and we're going to until the end of the war. And I believe, having done the research in this, that what actually happened was Roosevelt, of course, was very, very tied up in the initial months of the war.
Really would have been, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just dropped on his lap more or less. Although, of course, they knew they had indications that it was going to happen. But in any case, it's my contention that Roosevelt, wanting nothing to do with Landis, gave it to his good buddy Clark Griffith, who was always visiting the White House. And he said to him something to the effect that, hey, you take this letter, you answer the SOB. I have no use for him. And so Griffith penned a letter in which he said, we're going to keep the game going, and he in Roosevelt's name, and he suggested that the teams might want to play more night games as a way to boost morale, even additionally from just having the games being played themselves. The reason I think that's one of the telltale signs that Roosevelt actually did not write the letter, and Griffith did, because Griffith had become a proponent of night baseball. Initially, he was dead set against it. He thought it was a terrible, evil thing that the game should be played under God's green grass and under His blue sky. And so that, to me, was a telltale sign that he actually penned the letter. And of course, it didn't trap FDR. What it did was it just defanged Landis. He had no way to do anything other than to continue the game, which they did. So when opening day came, there were actually 7 nationals on the opening day roster that were gone because of either trades or through the draft, right? So, in fact, his two biggest stars, Cecil Travis and Buddy Lewis, who we'll probably talk about during the course of the show, they were gone, and they went into the war, both of whom actually served very, very honorably. And so that's where we stand at the beginning of the 42 season. One of the interesting things is that one of the first professional teams to actually play most of its games under the lights was the Kansas City Monarchs of the Negro American League, because they had purchased a portable lighting system. And they went around barnstorming, but playing at night under the lights. So that was another interesting little anecdote. So let's just chat about it.
Let me ask you a question. how did it become the green light letter?
Well, he gave him the green light to go ahead with the game.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a name, Ronnie, and David and I both, we sort of agree on this. We think that Clark Griffith actually wrote the letter, and then the president signed it. But we feel, but it was called the green light letter, which is probably named by somebody in the press because it gave the go ahead to baseball.
Right.
So that's where the name came from.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense.
It's
very fascinating.
Most people probably don't know this, but Griffith and Roosevelt had become very close friends over the years. They met in 1919 when Clark Griffith was at the flagpole of opening day ceremonies, and the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Roosevelt, joined him there. This was before he came down with
polio.
Yeah, polio, right, exactly. I was trying to think of the more formal. Anyway, so he walked out there, and the two of them became quite good friends. During the course of the war, they saw each other an awful lot.
Well, they did, David, and the thing that the proximity of the White House and Griffith Stadium, Mr. Griffith would make a trip every year. It was traditional, just like the president throwing out the first ball opening day. But he would present the president with season tickets at the White House, and he'd also have a purse or some gift for Mrs. Roosevelt, and that was part of the friendship that had developed over the years. And as David said, it really began in, I think it was 1919 when Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And I think when you look at it in historical terms, the 1918 baseball season, from my research, was canceled. Part of it was canceled because of World War I. So this was not going to be a repeat of what went on in baseball in World War I for World War II. And if Mr. Griffith wrote the letter, Roosevelt signed it, it was sent to the commissioner, and it said, okay, baseball is going to go on for the good of the country. It makes sense to me, and David has made a very good point of it, that he actually thinks that it was Clark Griffith who really wrote the letter.
By the way,
Griffith really had a lot of power. He was
tremendous. Yeah,
very close to the president.
And he was in a very good position to act as sort of the titular head of baseball during the war because he was right there with Roosevelt. Interesting fact about Griffith too, and George, you just brought this up about World War I. During World War I, Griffith was a great supporter of the doughboys, the American forces that went over to France. And he supplied baseball bats and gloves and balls. He sent them over to the camps so that the players would have something to amuse themselves with before going to France. And he was prepared and did the very same thing in World War II. He was a big proponent of raising funds for the Army and the Navy through the Army Relief Fund and the Navy Relief Fund. And in fact, they played several interracial games. People talk about, well, why didn't the Negro Leagues play the American League? They had a couple of exhibition games that were played, but for the war relief effort. But Landis, who in addition to everything else was pretty much a racist, banned the playing of the two leagues for anything but those kinds of games, just to raise money. So that was another reason why they didn't. There's another sort of mark against Landis historically. But yeah,
he was a bad guy. He was a bad guy.
Yeah, he was
a terrible guy.
Yeah. Well, what David's bringing out, Ronnie and Ralph, and some people have talked about, Clark Griffith. I don't want to get into the whole racial thing, but they accused him of being a racist, and I don't believe that he was. Now, when it comes to Calvin Griffith, his adopted son, with the twins and the senators before that, I would say there could be a good case made for it. But in terms of Clark Griffith, I think it was strictly an economic situation that he knew the great players with the Homestead Grays, Josh Gibson and Cool Papa Bell. If they were signed by Washington, it would dramatically affect the attendance of the Homestead Grays playing at Griffith Stadium, and they were a tenant. Griffith received income from the rental of Griffith Stadium to the Homestead Grays, just like he received income from the rental of Griffith Stadium to the Washington Redskins. It was strictly an economic situation, in my opinion. Had nothing to do with race. It had to do with money.
One more thing about 1942, as the war began, and Ronnie, you probably know about this. Jackie Robinson had a baseball tryout, with a pitcher by the name of Moreland in 1942.
That's right. He did. And they passed on him.
They didn't even let him. They didn't even let him have this tryout. It was the Chicago White Sox.
I believe it was up in Boston, wasn't it?
No, that was 44. That was later. That was 45.
Okay.
Yeah, that was
I thought it was Boston.
It was, but that was in 45. He actually had Robinson was a California native, and I think his name was Sam Moreland. The two of them requested a tryout from the Chicago White Sox, and while the White Sox used, in 42, right, and the White Sox used to train in California, and they never got their green light letter. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot that can be said. There's a lot that can be said about World War II in baseball, and I just wanted to bring up part of the fact that Washington itself, the ball club, was directly impacted by World War II. And David has mentioned two of the stars of the team, Cecil Travis and Buddy Lewis, both faced combat. Cecil had his feet frozen in the Battle of the Bulge, and Buddy Lewis flew the hump in Burma, so they were two major stars that were not made available to the club anymore because they were part of the war effort, and they were in combat. They were in actual direct combat, as opposed to many of the players that were on service teams and that kind of thing. But they were, faced the enemy, and both were good friends and teammates of my dad, and my dad always told me about the effort on behalf of Washington to really preserve the memory of Cecil and Buddy for their contributions to the war effort. Now, the other part of it with World War II is that Washington was also directly impacted by the fact that they had three players that were part of the World War II effort. One was Elmer Gedeon. Elmer Gedeon was an outfielder with Washington in 1939. He was killed in 1944 in an airplane crash. He was shot down over France. Jimmy Trimble, who was a great prospect, Clark Griffith thought he was one of the greatest prospects he ever saw, never played in the major leagues, was a high-ranked minor league player, went into service, was killed at Iwo Jima. And the third player was somebody who maybe a lot of people would never even think about, but the fact is that Washington had a pitcher by the name of Lefty Brewer, and Lefty Brewer was a Washington pitcher, never pitched in the major leagues, but was on the roster in 1938 and 1939, and Lefty Brewer, again, a teammate of my dad, I showed David a baseball with Lefty Brewer's autograph on it, a team baseball from 1938. Lefty Brewer was killed at Normandy during D-Day. So there's three players with an association with Washington that directly were affected because they lost their lives in what David Bedingfield in Europe has a newsletter called Baseball's Greatest Sacrifice, and he talks about these three gentlemen.
Yeah, and there were throughout the war effort, there were very few major leaguers who actually were killed in the game. Interestingly enough, and happily enough, I guess you would say, there were. But George, I'm sure you knew this, but the 1942 season began. Your dad was the only one left of the regular outfield.
Yeah, he was, and he was because he was 4F, and he had been declared 4F by the draft board. if he had been able to serve, he would have served, but the draft board, because he had a shoulder separation, said that, he could not pass the physical as far as the service was concerned, so he was kept on playing. But on the other hand, what he had to do in the off season, which was part of the agreement with Major League Baseball, was the fact that he had to work in a defense industry plant during the off season, and he did. In Trenton, New Jersey, he built Avenger torpedo bombers for the war effort. So that was the agreement that Major League Baseball had with any player who was declared 4F.
Yeah, a number of and they all worked close to their home team's town,
right.
Because they could work. In fact, some of them actually worked there during the weekdays on their normal shift, and actually a couple of them actually suited up and played on the weekend, played baseball on the weekend for their team when they were home. So that
right, they did that. David, you're right. They did that, and they also, the other part of it, and this isn't actually a part of our subject, but the fact is that during World War II there were travel restrictions, and the teams could no longer go to their normal spring training facilities. They had to have spring training close to home. So the Washington club was fortunate because of the fact that they were able to train at the University of Maryland in 43, 44, and 45 and didn't have to travel to Florida. But on the other hand, some of the northern teams, they actually had to travel and train in New England or in the Midwest where they had snow on the ground. And I've got pictures and have seen pictures of ball players, training on ski slopes with skis and throwing snowballs rather than baseballs.
Yeah, it was Landis actually who started that by advising the teams to abandon their training camps in Florida and California. Later on, the Office of Defense Transportation that year issued some restrictions on travel, and so what the owners did was they reduced the number of road trips between the East Coast teams and the Midwest teams from 4 annually to 3. And they played, rather than a 3-game series, they'd play a 4 or 5-game series. So they got all 154 games in with less train travel. That was a big part of the war effort.
It's David, you're right. You're absolutely right. And Ronnie, you might be surprised to hear this, but David knows it, and I know, and Ralph, there were scheduled doubleheaders.
Uh-huh.
Now, today, a doubleheader is rarity. I don't know whether they even have any scheduled doubleheaders, but back then, I know for a fact, I think it was 1944 or 45, Washington on the regular schedule played 44 scheduled doubleheaders.
Isn't that something? Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, and
they were not day-night doubleheaders. They were
no.
back to back.
Yeah, back to
they were day game doubleheaders. They were day game doubleheaders, and many of the day games, those games lasted less than 2 hours. So in essence, they could play sometimes a doubleheader in 4 hours, as opposed to today where they play one game in 4.5 or 5 hours.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
What do you think
the reason is why it's taking so long now versus then?
Well, personally, I think part of it, David, is, Ronnie, is the fact that you have so many commercials now, and that extends it. And now you've got, pitch counts and all the pitching changes, and everybody's got a posture up there at the plate, fussing around with their batting gloves and doing all that kind of stuff. In an earlier era, they didn't do that. The game was there to be played. They went out and played the game. The pitchers, a starting pitcher, he knew he was going to get the ball, and if he didn't get hit, he was going to finish the game. And, any commercials were radio commercials because there wasn't such a thing as television broadcast. Sure. Television hadn't been, I think the first game was 1939. It was actually on television, but it was not a commercial type broadcast. So a totally different world than today, where you've got all the interruptions and constant commercials that are being shown because, that's the tail wagging the dog. That money is very important.
That's
it. Networks and the ball clubs, and that's what it is.
Right.
There's another interesting little phenomenon that I credit my father for, but I have no idea if it's true because nobody's ever refuted it or given me a better explanation. If you'll remember, George, in the 50s, all the way up into the 50s, the defending team would leave their gloves on the field as they ran in to come up to bat.
Right.
And they did that. And I asked my father once while we were at a Yankees game, well, why do they do that? He said it speeds up the game. Now, I couldn't figure out how, even as a kid, I couldn't figure out how that speeds up the game by not carrying your glove into the dugout and carrying it back out on the field. But they always left their gloves on the field. And so if you want to add the ridiculous to the sublime, that's one of the reasons why the game was faster in those days.
Well, David, that's very interesting. I had not heard that before, but I know that was the tradition for many years.
Yeah.
For the infielders in particular to leave their gloves, and a lot of them used to
the glove for
practice.
The other team?
Yeah. Well,
right
no,
on the field.
Yeah, they leave them
at that position, right near the position.
Yeah, Phil Rizzuto was renowned for flipping his glove. He wanted to make sure that his glove would land, a certain way each time. So he'd be out there flipping his glove. But that's what they did up until the 50s. I remember even when I was playing, that was our tradition for infielders. Now, not for outfielders, but for infielders, you leave your glove right behind the position that you played. So that was part of it.
And then the other team would use the glove?
No, they would leave theirs on the field when they left the field to come to bat.
Right.
So how would they? When they're running the bases and stuff, who's going to trip over the glove?
Well, the gloves were not on the dirt part of the field. They were on the fringe of the infield outfield grass.
Yeah. But it was. I wish there were a couple of old timers around that we could even have. There's got to be one or two. I know a couple of the real old Yankee ball players are still alive. Bobby Brown, he'd probably remember, down in Texas, and what was his buddy down there who played for the Yankees briefly, Eddie Robinson.
Right.
They would probably know.
They probably would, David. And as a matter of fact, Eddie Robinson and my dad were teammates with the Indians in '46. So, if anybody ever talked to Eddie, if they would mention it to him that my dad and Eddie, they were actually teammates with the Cleveland Ball Club. But that part about the leaving the gloves, and I'm not sure when it ended, but to my knowledge, nobody ever tripped over a glove or had an accident or whatever. Just like in the old days when they had the photographers on the field. I mean, you never see that today, but back then that was part of the game. And if you look at some of the old photographs, you'll actually see the photographers on the field because that, they did not have zoom lenses and that kind of thing. That's how they got close-up action shots, and they were allowed on the field as part of the game.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
By the way, George, you mentioned Eddie Robinson and the connection you have with him, and you said if somebody should. I think if you had the opportunity to write a letter, he lives in Texas. I think you can get his address from baseball writers. The research. Just to find out, because let's face it, he's 98 or so, and may not be around much longer. So if you get that opportunity, write the letter, see what happens.
Yeah,
it'll be interesting.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's a good suggestion, David. I think I'll try to do that.
Yeah. Oh, one other thing we should mention about the wartime players in Washington. Dutch Leonard went over with one of their top pitchers during the war. Went over on a USO tour, and he was mobbed wherever he went. All they wanted to do was talk baseball with him. In fact, he wandered off the base one time just to go into town, and he nearly lost his life coming back because the sentry gave him his password, and Leonard had forgotten what his password was. And when the sentry recognized him, he said, "Oh, okay, come on in, but don't ever do that again." Shot.
Well, no, you know what, David? I had heard that story about, and Dutch and my dad were very good friends. Matter of fact, Dutch used to come up and visit with my mother and father, and I remember meeting him as a little boy and hearing Dutch and my dad talk about that, and they laughed about it. But that was true. And Dutch, he was lucky because the sentry did recognize him. And part of what the sentries used to do during World War II, because there was a many of the Germans had infiltrated behind the lines and were wearing American uniforms and all that kind of stuff, the sentries would actually ask somebody, they'd say, who was the second baseman for such and such? And figuring that any American GI or American serviceman would know the answer, but a German would not. And that was one of the ways they were able to tell friend from foe during World War II, if there was, in fact, not a password, but if a sentry, came up with somebody and somebody in a uniform would say, yeah, I'm American, and they'd say, okay, well, who was the second baseman for the Dodgers in 1944? And they knew that the Germans would not know that because this was a baseball question.
Right, and baseball terminology figured prominently too in dispatches and things going back and forth where they could talk to one another without even if the Germans picked up the communication, they wouldn't understand the reference.
Right. That's absolutely true.
And it's true. Baseball played an integral part.
Yes, it did.
Well, it did, and the other part of it, and David mentioned about the fundraising and that kind of thing, but another Washington player who was very much involved in that was Zeke Benora, who was the first baseman who played with the White Sox and Washington. Zeke was a great hitter. He was not much of a fielder, but he was decorated by General Eisenhower during World War II for his efforts on behalf of the U.S. Army to acquire equipment, playing fields, and that kind of thing for the GIs. So, Zeke did not face combat, but on the other hand, he did do a lot to raise the morale and money for servicemen who were overseas.
Speaking of morale, we couldn't really not talk about the famous Washington pitcher, one-legged pitcher, Bert Shepard. He was a great morale booster.
One-legged.
Yeah, Bert Shepard. Yeah. I'll tell you the story because
go ahead,
I knew it exactly because I remember my dad talking about it. Bert Shepard was shot down over Germany by the enemy, had his leg partially amputated by German doctors, was repatriated to the United States, and was able to talk to Mr. Griffith. He said, his burning lifelong ambition was to become a major league pitcher. And Mr. Griffith had said, well, Bert, the best I can do for you right now, I can make you a batting practice pitcher, and that's what he did. But on the other hand, Washington needed a reliever desperately because many of the players were into the war. So Bert Shepard against Boston was able to pitch, I think, 5 or 6 innings in an actual major league game on his wooden leg. And it was remarkable the fact that here he was, because of his perseverance, was able to pitch in a major league game. And then, because of the proximity to Walter Reed Hospital, Bert Shepard would make visits and talk to servicemen and boost their morale. And what David was talking about, he played a very important role. And many people, today they would say Bert Shepard, who'd never heard of him. Well, Bert Shepard during the war certainly made his contribution because of what he did on behalf of baseball in World War II.
Yeah, it was the only game he played. The only game he played. The game was out of reach when he did come in. The starting pitcher never pitched another inning, and he was actually he's from Ireland, and I forget his name right now. But he had pitched terribly, so Washington was way behind, and they brought Bert in to pitch, and actually he did quite well. Not only did he pitch about 5.5 innings, I think he only gave up a couple of hits, and he managed, and he threw out they started to try to bunt on him, and he threw out a couple of base runners, and actually he did well at the plate too. I mean, I don't think he got any hits, but at least he stood up there and took a couple of whacks. I forget, George. Do you know what
Well, yeah, I'm not sure how he did at the plate, but I do know that I remember hearing my dad talk about the effectiveness that he did as a pitcher, and what David was saying was that he did. I think he pitched a number of innings. I think he might have given up one run, maybe a hit or two, but he struck out some. I mean, doing all this on a wooden leg, which was remarkable. And
incredible.
Especially
with the bunting and all that.
Yeah, I have a photo actually of Bert Shepard in the cockpit of his plane that was shot down over Germany that he personalized to my dad, saying, George, good luck and all that. I mean, it was so prophetic to see that, and my dad and Bert were quite good friends. But on the other hand, when you think about it today, and they talked about one-arm Pete Gray and that kind of thing, and Jim Abbott being, a great pitcher recently with only one arm. But here was Bert Shepard, a pitcher
with one leg,
pitching on one leg.
And go ahead. I'm sorry.
It was just incredible. And my dad told me, he said, we never really appreciated how courageous an effort it was on behalf of Bert to do that.
Yeah, it's interesting because just prior to him really signing on with Washington, the Yankees tried to recruit him. They actually sent a plane down to bring him back to New York so he could talk to New York ownership. And for whatever reason, he came back to Washington. I guess maybe Mr. Griffith had really, sold him on playing for Washington. And but Griffith was really irate. I mean, they were trying to poach his player, and the other group of people who were irate was the Negro press. The Negro press was very upset by that because they felt, here are able-bodied ball players that can't get a break in the major leagues, and Washington goes out and signs a one-legged pitcher. It really irked them, and there were a number of columns written about that, and it didn't sit well with the black baseball fans.
Well, you know what, David, and that again, you and I have talked about it. I believe it's more of an economic situation, but on the other hand, you can look at the political. The fact is that here was a great human interest story of having Bert Shepard in our nation's capital pitching for the Washington Senators during the height of World War II, and then visiting Walter Reed Hospital to encourage GIs who had suffered some of these devastating injuries to keep their head up and keep working on it, because there was a chance that they would be able to succeed in whatever they wanted to do, based upon their ambition and desire and their ability to overcome their injuries.
Yeah, and Griffith was a great patriot, so he really would do just about anything to boost morale of the troops and carry on the spirit. So his signing of Shepard was, as you mentioned, George, that was his intention, was to boost morale and show the flag a little bit. So, but it turned out well for all parties involved. Except for the Red Sox players who had to go up there and try to hit him.
Right. No, that's it. And I know that we've talked at length about World War II and Washington and Memorial Day, but I just felt it was a good subject for the upcoming Memorial Day weekend, because we do thank our veterans, our servicemen, and the fact that so many did make the ultimate sacrifice, and it did have a little bit. Baseball made the ultimate sacrifice as well.
Right. Oh,
yeah.
Very fascinating.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier, George, about Washington practicing at the University of Maryland, and that was brought about. If you ever went to a football game at Maryland, you sat in Byrd Stadium. Well, it was named after the president of the university, who actually was the one who invited Griffith and the team to practice there, because they needed to stay close to home. And another point we should not miss out on was that during the war, Washington was in a wonderful position to play service teams because of all the forts and bases
right.
in and around the Washington area. So Washington actually took a couple of trips down the Potomac where they didn't have to take trains. They could go on by boat and play down at Norfolk, which had two very semi-professional baseball teams here that gave Washington some good competition.
Well, they sure did, David. You make a good point because Washington did that. There were two bases that were really populated by so many ex and current major league players, Norfolk and Great Lakes. And those two, Bill Dickey was running the Great Lakes team, and Norfolk. I've seen pictures of Phil Rizzuto and some others with a Norfolk uniform. So you're absolutely correct about that. Washington was in a wonderful position because they could play, those service teams that were really major league caliber teams. So it wasn't that they were playing against a bunch of has-beens and also-rans. They were actually playing against current major league players who just so happened to be playing in the service at the time.
Yeah, and that too was a great morale boost for the soldiers on the bases and the airmen.
Oh, they would come out, absolutely. They come out by the thousands to watch these games. It was terrific. Yep.
And they enjoyed the trip down the Potomac to out of the Chesapeake Bay down to Norfolk. Yeah, so it worked out well for everyone.
Well, I know my dad in particular was very, very much, involved as much as he could be, the fundraising efforts and doing all that kind of stuff. I've got pictures of a doubleheader that they were playing, an exhibition game between Washington and the Yankees, and there was a game that featured Babe Ruth and Walter Johnson exhibition. My dad did some auctioning of his baseball spikes, the war relief effort. So the ball players, and not just my father, all the ball players were doing that kind of thing. And as David mentioned, like a Dutch Leonard, he was going over there and talking to the troops and almost lost his own life because of the situation. But, ball players in general, they did whatever they could do to help the war effort. If they were either playing or if they were in the service, that they would be able to, contribute whatever they could to the morale of the country. Because back then, baseball was the national pastime, period. There was no competition from any other sport. I mean, baseball was what, covered
that was it.
The sporting news as an example. I mean, they covered baseball. It was a daily situation. The players would pick up the newspaper to see, where their batting average was or whatever, and the fans would talk about it. And that's part of the fabric of life during the World War II era, much different than today, where Major League Baseball is competing against the other professional sports. Back then, the other professional sports were in their infancy, and the fact is that baseball was the national pastime. Everybody talked about baseball, period.
Yeah. And I still think it is.
Yes, I do too.
Well, we do. I'm not so sure how many of today's fans do, but we are baseball people, so it's very significant for us.
Well, it's still called the national.
Like the NFL had a huge surge, but I think that's starting to fall back a ways.
It does seem to be, yeah.
And I think that the baseball has come back again.
Mm-hmm.
The attendance continues to go up all over the nation. So,
the minor leagues were actually really decimated. The younger guys hadn't made it. A lot of those leagues had to fold during the war. Some never came back. And during the course of this happening over the war years, it was Branch Rickey issued a warning to the baseball owners saying that, look, we have to be prepared to get that up and running as soon as possible. Otherwise, and it was a most prophetic letter or message because he warned that football, if we don't do anything about it, football will soon surpass us and overtake us in attendance. And I mean, you talk about prophecy. It really did come true. I don't think Ricky was alive, when the changeover actually happened statistically. But he issued that warning. But unfortunately, there wasn't much they could do during the minor leagues. They all traveled by bus during the war, and gas rationing was in place, and so a lot of the players many of them were young kids who were in prime condition and ready and went into the Army or Navy. So
well, they did, David. They did, and a lot of those young kids that were, because they were 18, 19 years old. I mean, they went into service, and that's what I mentioned earlier about a Jimmy Trimble, who actually was a tremendous prospect, 18, 19-year-old kid, and here he was, put into harm's way, and actually lost his life at Iwo Jima. So, I mean, that was a fact of life, that so many of these young kids who potentially could have been fantastic baseball players, were serving their country before they were able to make a major league roster.
Yep.
Right.
Well, we'll try
Ralph, you've been quiet. You have anything you'd like to talk about?
I don't know if Ralph is there.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
I feel our leader is not here.
Our leader's not here.
Well, I guess we'll sign off then, and we'll look forward to next week. And David, Ronnie, it's always.
I had one question, maybe.
Yep.
Do you recall the time when the manager used to be the third base coach?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Leo DeRocha was famous for that. Leo DeRocha did that. Yep. Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of the managers did that.
Yep.
They were on third base. Yeah. And I remember in 1972 when Jackie Robinson was being honored at the World Series in Cincinnati, and he said, "Thank you very much for this honor, but I won't be happy till I see a black face as a manager on the third base coaching line in baseball." And I remember that, but a lot of the fans today have no clue that ever happened.
Right.
Yeah.
Ronnie, that's a very interesting comment, and you are correct. A lot of the managers did manage, from third base, and later what happened, I know because my dad had been a third base coach, the managers would stay in the dugout. They would relay the signs to the third base coach, who then, in fact, would relay the signs to the hitter. So, I mean, a lot of that where the manager had been the third base coach and was, making the decisions and giving the signals, that did change. But in the earlier time, you're absolutely correct that oftentimes the manager was the third base coach.
And I remember that. I mean, I saw games like that in Milwaukee. Absolutely.
Right.
You wonder why. You wonder how it changed. I mean, why? I don't have any idea. I don't have any clue.
Yeah, I don't have any idea either. But I do know for a fact that it did change, and maybe it was the fact that the managers felt more comfortable in the dugout with a bench coach, and they talk about situations and that kind of thing. But the third base coach was always the signal giver, and the first base coach basically, his job was to keep the runner close to base or give him a lead or tell him about, the situation or whatever. But the actual signs were given by the third base coach.
Yeah. And Ronnie, you asked about that.
Manager might, from the dugout, give the signal. The third base coach does. Yeah.
Yeah. When Leo DeRocha was managing the Giants, I never saw him when he was managing the Dodgers because I never got out to Ebbets Field. But I know at the Polo Grounds, he would come out in the first inning, bottom of the first, when the Giants were coming to bat. And the first thing he would do is take his spikes and he would erase the chalk line that distinguished the coach's box. And he did this.
He would like to move around, didn't he?
He liked to move around. I don't know. It really, from what I understand, the grounds crew was really apoplectic because he did it every game, and they had to go out and put it back every game. But it was gone. I guess it was. Must have been a superstition. Ball players are very superstitious.
Oh yeah,
superstitious. That's right.
Yeah, a lot of them will say, don't ever step on the baseline. They'll jump across it and all that kind of stuff.
You'll see them jump over the chalk line.
That's right.
Over something. Yeah, it's so funny. They're all superstitious. They all have their little idiosyncrasies. See, I have a very interesting thing that came up this week. I'm going to be speaking up in Canada in July. And then I also was invited to speak at the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown.
Oh, great.
So,
Well, good for you,
isn't that great?
Hey,
Yeah, so I'm going to be
great.
up there on the 14th of July. I'm looking forward to it. It'll be very exciting.
That's a good time to go up there. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
It'll be a couple weeks. I've been there.
Yeah, I was up there in September of 2015 because our DVD was honored by the Hall of Fame Film Festival, so I had a chance to be up there and talk a little bit. And Ronnie, if you're going to be speaking up there, please tell Bruce Marcus and a few of the others up there that I said hello. Because that's a wonderful honor for you and a great situation
this
for
will
you
be
to be in.
The third time. The
well,
first
that's
time
wonderful.
was in April, but this will be better in the summer. It'll be even better. And I work with.
Well, congratulations. As David mentioned, Cooperstown itself is just a beautiful town.
I love it.
Just apart from the Hall of Fame, I mean, it's just gorgeous. It's right on the lake, and they have flower boxes, and it's just beautiful. So enjoy yourself.
If you're a baseball fan, it's like going. You've died and gone to heaven.
It's Valhalla. Yeah,
no question.
Everything.
Yeah.
All the stores, all the restaurants, everything is baseball.
Yes.
So great.
Yes. Yeah.
It's terrific. Yeah, I've been there twice. Spoke there twice. So.
Yep.
But as I say, it was always in April, so this will be great.
No, it will.
Yeah, looking forward to it, yeah. All right, well, this was fun.
Okay.
I really enjoyed, David, I really enjoyed your sharing this story with us, and George, of course, always.
Well, the Nats and the Grays is out in paperback now, and is published by Roman and Littlefield, so anyone who wants to get a copy can Google and Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com, or just order it from your local bookstore, and it's available.
Fabulous.
Well, I can vouch for David's book. It's a wonderful book. He did a great job, wonderful research, and a lot of photographs, and it was a pleasure for me to help him provide with some information. And David did a wonderful job putting it all together. So good luck with that. And Ronnie, good luck with your Cooperstown trip, and you're going up to Canada, and it sounds great. I'll talk to you gentlemen later.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Guys.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.